So thank you so much, Christina. And I want to thank you also for the invitation to be here today and engage in conversation with an artist that I have long admired, Liu Xi, whose work is fantastic. And it was great for me to actually be able to see it here in the museum this morning. So hello, everyone, guten Tag, and also da jiao hao. I'm going to start by actually showing you some slides that I think will provide an interesting context for the conversation that Liu Xi and I will then go on to have. And I do want to say that it was such a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of the academic advisory team for this exhibition, for Stepping Out. It's a very significant exhibition. I was really sad not to be able to see its first iteration at Lillehammer Museum in Norway because of COVID restrictions. So it's a really great pleasure to be here in beautiful Salzburg and to see it in reality and to have this conversation with Liu Xi, albeit on Zoom, because Liu Xi, of course, is in Shanghai. So I want to start really by giving you a bit of context about a particular interest of mine, which is about the relationship that many artists have explored between ideas, about ideas of motherhood and of daughterhood. So really, in some ways, that was the focus of my essay for the catalogue for the exhibition. The idea of motherhood, how women artists in China have often explored this theme in their work, whether from the standpoint of mothers or daughters, and how that theme has revealed a kind of process of tumultuous social change in China, a society really in rupture in many ways. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. I hope that people can see the screen. I think that you could. Sorry, I'm just going to try that again. Okay, so you should be able to see that slide now, I believe. Okay, so this part of our conversation today, I've titled it as Motherhood, Daughterhood, and Materiality. That idea of the intersection between the physical materials of making art and the themes that artists are engaging with, the ideas that they're engaging with. I think these themes of motherhood and daughterhood reflect the sort of dissonant and disquieting experience of living in a society that's in a process of transformation. Sometimes we see in this exhibition that it's really explicitly about the experience of motherhood. So, for example, Xiao Yu's fountain of projectile breast milk, or some in very taboo-breaking ways, such as Li Xinmo's works that use menstrual blood as her ink for her self-portraits, that really expressed her particular challenges as a single mother. Some are exploring the difficulties of daughterhood. For example, a performance by Ma Qiusha, when she speaks about her experiences of childhood, and we realize at the end of the video of this performance that she's been speaking with a razor blade in her mouth. But this work here in this slide is a work by Bu Hua, a pioneer of digital animation in China. And I've chosen this image because I love the joyful fearlessness of the little girl, a schoolgirl who is really the avatar or the alternative persona for Bu Hua herself. She's the artist's alter ego, if you like. And in this work, for example, amongst the sort of profusion of flowers and birds and curling clouds, we see her alter ego wielding a sword on top of a mountain, like the star of a martial arts movie. So she's a schoolgirl, she's dressed in the white shirt and red scarf of the Young Pioneers Communist Youth Organization. She's facing off against a fighter jet. And Bu Hua's works are very much about memories of childhood. They're about intersections between East and West influences in her work, intersections between tradition and contemporaneity. But they're also about being a dutiful daughter of a very famous printmaker, Farbe. And she says that she learned the language of lines at a very young age. And she's, in a way, paying homage to her father and his work as a woodblock printer in works, even though she's using a digital form to do so. She's also thinking about herself as a mother in these works. It was very much her fears of the future in a world facing climate catastrophe and geopolitical tensions represented by the fighter jet that we see in this work and other works. And that began to creep into her work once she had given birth to a child. So even though it's not obvious, I think these works, nostalgic though they are very much also about this theme of mothers and daughters. And certainly Bourgeois says about her work, and in the huge work that's in the exhibition here in Salzburg, that on the surface they appear perhaps to be very cute, but when you look below the surface and you examine them more closely, there is a darker truth that emerges. I'd also could mention in this context Cui Xiuwen, who's such an important feminist artist who sadly died much too young in 2018. This photograph here that was taken in her studio some years ago makes me really sad, but also so pleased and privileged to have had that experience of meeting her and talking about her work. As a feminist artist, she started the Sirens studio of 4 women artists who began to explore the life experiences of women in particular. And for example, in Ladies' Room, in the video that's in the exhibition in Stepping Out, a very notorious work from the year 2000. She took a hidden camera into a Beijing karaoke bar. She recorded the semi-private female space of the toilets and the escorts, or the essentially sex workers who were changing their clothes, talking on the phone, counting their money as they went in and out of the toilet cubicles. So a private space where we don't actually see the male clients who are outside the door of the toilets there. So very much a work again about a transforming society, the resurgent sexual economy of reform and opening China, and these young women who are, making their way in a hostile world, and possibly migrants from the countryside to the big city. It caused a great deal of shock and consternation when it was first shown, and in fact resulted in a court case when someone was so profoundly shocked and disturbed by seeing this, this difficult truth, this unfortunate reality. It was considered. Cui Xiuwen, though, like Bourgeois, also explored her memories of childhood. She was born in Heilongjiang in the far north of China, but she positions in these works her models in this context of a very familiar Beijing environment. So she used young models in her digital and photographic works that were really stand-ins for the artist herself. They were vehicles, if you like, for her to explore her memory. And again, of course, they're wearing the red scarf of the young pioneers. So in this series called One Day in 2004, we're really seeing, I guess, the artist exploring traumatic memories. These models positioned in front of the, strong, powerful imperial architecture of Beijing often appear to be visibly wounded, or sometimes they have robotic prosthetic limbs, as we see in this work here. So there's this great sense of vulnerability in the young girls that are positioned in the works themselves. And again, in the series of angels, and there is one of these in the exhibition as well that features multiple images of the same young pregnant woman. Here in Angel number 13 from 2006, we see the pregnant woman apparently sleeping against the backdrop of the rising city. So we see the crane in the background, we see the smog partially concealing the mountains. We have the sense that while this work is very beautiful, intentionally so, the serenity of the work is undercut by something much more disturbing. So Cui Xiuwen's pregnant protagonist is sleeping through this great social change. In other works, they're sleepwalking. She seems, again, very vulnerable, and we question the direction of the society and the well-being of the unborn children that we see in these works as well. She then returned to Heilongjiang to make this series in 2009, Existential Emptiness, where she replaced some of the young women, the human models, with very lifelike dolls. And in fact, it's almost impossible to tell the difference in these works. I know when I went to interview her in her studio, one of these dolls was propped up in a chair, and I kept feeling as if it was watching me while I was speaking with the artist. It was really quite disturbing. I want also to mention the artist Yu Hong, shown here in her Beijing studio in 2013. There's a really important figurative series shown in Stepping Out. Her work, like many others, is often quite autobiographical. And I guess she's revealing public truths through a personal lens on private experience. She often looks at particular issues in society. This work in the photograph here is just one panel of a multi-paneled work that's based on a Jan van Eyck altarpiece, but instead of the saints and the holy figures in the original, it's featuring Beijing citizens who are all fast asleep. So again, there's this idea of exhaustion at a society that's changing so rapidly, but also that idea, I guess, of being asleep, of sleepwalking, perhaps avoiding certain realities through sleep, that sleep becomes an escape. The series in the exhibition, though, is from the ongoing and enormous Witness to Growth series. And here what Yu Hong is doing is juxtaposing an image that's taken from her own life, sometimes from family photographs, with an image that comes from a newspaper or a popular magazine. So in this one, for example, Yu Hong at 12 years old, 1978, we see this rather idealized image from a magazine of the children sketching in the countryside. And then we see this much more formally posed, somewhat awkward image of Yu Hong's family taken from a photograph. Here, from a similarly autobiographical series called 500 Mirrors, Yu Hong turned 50 and looked back on the 50 years of her life. And she painted one work for each of her 50 years. So these are just details from this large work, this series of paintings. And on the left, we see the toddler Yu Hong riding her tricycle, all dressed in revolutionary red. And around her neck is an enormous, decorative badge that's showing the very, very famous propaganda painting called Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan. And it's probably worth noting here that Yu Hong's mother herself had worked as a propaganda painter and then taught painting at Minzu University in Beijing. So she's very much from a kind of artistic dynasty, if you like. On the right-hand side, again, we're seeing a schoolgirl wearing the red scarf of the young pioneers. And here's the schoolgirl Yu Hong looking somewhat apprehensively out as if on a stage through the sort of red curtain. And we see her from both the front and the back in this work, as if she's looking, at an unknown future. From the same series, Yu Hong, 28 years old, Liu Hua was born, 1994. So this one is about the birth of her daughter. And, of course, a hugely significant event. But on the left, again, it's juxtaposed with a page from the People's Daily. So we're seeing that juxtaposition between the private, the personal, the life of the individual, and then, the continuing public life of China, the change of China and how it's represented in the media. So, I guess one of the many aspects of life that was transformed in China after the Cultural Revolution was motherhood. In revolutionary times, private familial relationships were very much secondary and certainly controlled by the state. And in the late 1980s and 1990s, that emphasis changed from the collective to the individual and the private. And I guess what we see here is this image of the young mother with her baby beside her at this, this moment of profound change in any woman's life, as I'm sure that Liu Xi and I will also talk about. So Witness to Growth, I think, is such an interesting series in the way that it represents both the change in China and the change in Yu Hong herself and her private life and her family. And so, I'm interested later on to hear how Liu Xi, as a member of a younger generation of artists, responds to works like these. If we go on, we look at this one again from Half Hundred Mirrors, and again showing Yu Hong with her baby daughter, Liu Hua, who I note has just graduated with a master's degree from MIT in the United States. So she's now a very grown-up young woman who's been living and working in the United States. But when we look at this, I think what we see is all of that anxiety and the uncertainty, as well as the joy that motherhood brings with it. Lin Tianmiao is also represented in Stepping Out, and again, a really interesting artist who is often described in a description that she herself denies as one of the few feminist artists in China. And she really rejects that description very strongly in conversation. But her work deals with aspects of women's lives. She's very ambivalent, I think, about feminism, although we might look at her work and think, look, she's working with textiles. She's working with fabric and sewing and stitching in ways that are reflective of the work of generations of women with domestic crafts, as well as in a fine arts context. And she also works with a technique that she herself invented called thread winding that links her, I think, to generations of women using thread and sewing and stitching, and also to her own mother, who she would stand beside and watch. And in particular, during the Cultural Revolution, her mother would be able to bring some samples of fabric home from a factory, and then they would be unwound to create new thread. So that idea of winding and unwinding has a particular personal and historical significance for Lin Tianmiao. And this particular installation that I'm showing you here, which was shown in New York, at Asia Society, is really a reflection about the artist's mother, about perhaps the very difficult relationship that women of her generation had with their mothers, who were of necessity focused on revolution and creating a socialist society rather than on the private life of the family, while juggling both roles, of course, as women have always had to do. Her mother was very ill at the time that Lin Tianmiao was making this work. So I think she was reflecting on that, but also reflecting on herself as a mother, and that there's a sort of visceral physicality in this work that I think we also see in many works in Stepping Out, including in Zhao Yu's Fountain of Breast Milk that I mentioned a little earlier, that's shown as a very large video in the exhibition, and it really has a sort of profound impact, I think. In this work here, Badges, Lin Tianmiao is, I think, being more overtly feminist. And what she has done here is taken all of the words, both Chinese and English, that have been used to describe women. So we can see English words here like slut and tart and cougar, and other Chinese words are faintly discernible. I know when this work was shown in Sydney at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Chinese audiences were finding it quite disturbing that these words were being publicly displayed. But she decided to make a long-term project of investigating the way that language has been used to define women, and often to define them within sexual roles in very stereotypical ways. Tao Aimin's huge work, River of Women, is showing in Stepping Out. And she's an artist that I have written about fairly extensively and recently curated a solo show of her work in Sydney. I think her work is particularly interesting because of its materiality. And she is focused, I think, very much on untold stories of women. As an artist who herself comes from a rural province, she investigated a very particular history in Hunan province of a written language that was invented by illiterate rural women, a language called Liu Xi, and she has used that often in her work. Not in this work. In this work, what she is using are the wooden washing boards that women traditionally would use to scrub their clothing against the ridged surface of the board. And on the reverse side of the boards, she has painted portraits of the old rural women who gave them to her. So it's a reflection about domestic labour and that sort of relentless nature of domestic labour. It's a very much in its installation, it's suggesting the passage of time, that idea of a river of time that runs through generations of women, but also, of course, literally the idea that women would be scrubbing their laundry at the edge of the river in the past. And the washing boards themselves are these really, interesting, obsolete artifacts that she uses as found objects in multiple installations, and then as ways to make prints and rubbings using ink. So in this work here, A Secret Language of Women, not showing in Stepping Out, but gives you an idea of what she then did to extend her language of the washboards. So she created this work comprising 8 hand-printed, hand-bound books, where each page of the book is printed from one of these wooden washing boards. She's then used Liu Xi text on the edges, and there's a video projected into the center of women's hands scrubbing the laundry and the sound of the laundry being scrubbed. So the washboards and the language become a sort of double way of uncovering an unwritten history, a history of women, who otherwise would be completely unremembered, and an invisible history in a sense. 2 works here from the exhibition recently in Sydney, and on the left you can see she's made rubbings from the washing boards with softly coloured inks that in a way almost appear like traditional landscape paintings, like shanshui painting. And the calligraphy on the scrolls here, and these are very long scrolls that go from ceiling to floor, are written in Liu Xi, and they're Liu Xi poems that were written by the women in the villages in the past. On the right-hand side, from a series called Woman's Journal, and what we see here is she's using a technique of creating rubbings by rubbing the ink through the paper onto the washing boards. So almost like the tradition of rubbings made from stone stele in China or from bronzes. And again, the calligraphy on this is written in Liu Xi. And I think what's interesting about this is that it also appears to have elements of the body. When you look at these works closely, you get a sense of rib cages and skeletons and bones, and that sense of the physicality of labour, as well as the ink is rubbed onto the washing board. So too the women spent their lives washing laundry, a thankless task, as is so often. And then in this work here, again from the Women's Journal series, and you see all the various, different grooves and ridges, and these weathered surfaces of the old boards. They become these very painterly, very expressive works. And Tao Aimin says Liu Xi is a kind of language, and washboards are also a kind of language. I was telling women's stories with 2 languages. And one of the things that I hope Liu Xi and I will also talk about is her work with washboards as well, which is very, very different, but also reflecting on a female history. So, of course, that brings us then to Liu Xi and in a moment to our conversation. And we can see from the image here that Liu Xi is working very much with ideas and themes and images of the female body. Her focus on women's bodies, on sexuality, and on her use of a material that's malleable and paradoxically both fragile and strong, so clay and very particularly porcelain, makes her work particularly interesting, I think. And so we see the scale of her work in these images here, and the way that she's often using some surprising materials to colour the works that she creates. And we'll see that in the image on the Zoom as well, with the green works behind Liu Xi in her studio. And of course, you know, I showed this to my students in Sydney recently, and they were a little bit taken aback at the series of gold vaginas in this series, which is part of the continuing series that's in Stepping Out called Our God is Great, which we see a version of here. This particular version is in a private collection in Sydney, and we can see the porcelain is coloured. It's coloured with iron, I think, rather than Indian ink, but we're going to ask Liu Xi to explain a little more about her technique in a moment. And we can see that, you know, unequivocally, she's dealing with the female body in a way that feminist artists have often done. And one of the particularly interesting things about Liu Xi, I think, is her, you know, her explicit acknowledgement of a feminist intention in her work, in the Our God is Great series, and in the work here in Stepping Out, where we see the clay forms that, you know, at first sight perhaps appear as if almost they're floral motifs, and then we look at how the vaginal forms or vulval forms have also been abstracted, but absolutely unmistakable. And we think about perhaps other artists, other feminist artists, such as Judy Chicago in the Dinner Party Project, in the Brooklyn Museum, and other feminist artists from an earlier generation of feminists in the 1970s who began to use vaginal imagery very explicitly in their work and to deal with themes such as menstruation. And there is a Chinese precursor, I guess a feminist, a matrilineal precursor, if you like, in the photographer Chen Lingyang, who made her work 12 Flower Months in 1999-2000, which looked at the artist's own menstruating body over 12 months of the year and related it to the particular flowers that are attached to each of the months of the year, and also suggested traditional forms of Chinese fan painting and of garden arrangements and floral motifs in these works here. And finally, I'll just put these slides up, which are Liu Xi's works using washing boards in her series called Mama. And I think, again, we come back to that notion of motherhood and the often complicated, sometimes fraught, sometimes very difficult relationships between mothers and daughters, where, you know, there is enormous love, but often that love is also fractured, and also it is subject to social forces, and particularly in China, of course, where you know, that the familial relationships have undergone such change in the revolutionary period, in the Cultural Revolution, and then in the reform and opening period at the end of the 20th century, which brought with it such dramatic social change. So Liu Xi, of course, casts washing boards in white porcelain. So it, you know, it really brings out the textures and the grooves of the boards, that each board itself seems to have a history, and each board almost seems to take on the persona of perhaps the woman who owned it. And they're like, you know, I often think when we see the boards lined up in this way, that they are almost like grave markers, or ghostly figures, ghostly antecedents and ancestor figures. So I wanted to end my PowerPoint with Liu Xi's work here, and I thought perhaps what we might do in a moment is leave those slides here so we can move through those as Liu Xi is talking about her work. But I wanted to, I guess, end with this note that I think is a really important one, that, the terrain of feminist art is a contested one, yet I would suggest that these women artists that I've shown you here and others in the exhibition that I haven't had the time to show in slides here, whether or not they identify as feminist, they're making work that reveals hidden histories, and they're very specific to female experiences and subjectivities. So when we examine these works through a lens of gender, I think they may clearly be understood as being underpinned by a feminist intention, whether that's explicitly claimed or not. And I think that they very much represent a refusal to accept the limitations and strictures of a still, in China, intensely patriarchal art ecology, not just the broader society, but the art world also. So I think perhaps at the start of our conversation, Liu Xi, we might leave the slides showing so that we can go back and look at particular examples of your work. And I hope that you're okay if I ask you some questions to start off our conversation now.
Yeah, please. Thank you so much for the introduction of all the artists' work. And I really, really appreciate that you know so much information besides the work. And even I didn't know so much as you do. You manage English and get to know so much. I really shocked. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, I'm, the last 3 years has been so difficult not to be able to go to China and talk to artists. And as you know, you and I have only talked through email and WeChat and Zoom. And so I'm very much looking forward to being able to return to China and talk to artists. I love visiting artists in their studios. So I hope to visit you in Shanghai or Jingdezhen, perhaps. But so thinking about Jingdezhen, I wanted to ask you firstly, if you can tell us about your love for the material of clay and specifically porcelain. So what is it about this material that inspires you?
Porcelain is, Jingdezhen, everything is about porcelain. And when I first being there, I just really enjoy with this material, because we need so much caring about this material, then could be get a nice pieces. So it really, for a few years, it's really practiced me as a, not only about artists, it practiced me as a personality, how much caring to this material. Then this material, like a human being, like we have a conversation and try to know more about this material, and then they try to feed me back and let me know who am I. So through this material, I discovered a lot of my own personality, a potential personality. Then gradually, after I know this material more, and then I add more context with my personal history in past life. So what I'm feeling right now has a dialect in transforming into a contemporary art way. But this material at the very beginning is really make me to deep and develop myself.
Yeah, because in fact you were studying sculpture, weren't you, at the Central Academy of Fine Arts? And yes, I think you told me that you saw a firing in the ceramics department, which really interested you and started you on this path towards working with clay. Is that right?
Yeah, getting to Kava, we do painting, we do lots of different practice. And when we do sculpture and we try different material like wood, stone, material, and the detect metal works and mix media, try all different things. And also I do lots of printing. In the end, I love the clay because it's very you can touch it, you can feel it, and it has temperature from 1,300 degree until the room temperature. It's such difference and many layers of meanings in this material. So I get to really like a physically feeling, I really love this material. So that starts with my creation. So it's it's really attractive. It's like you like someone, but you didn't know the reason, but gradually you get to know why. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really great way of describing it, I think. And if we think about your Our God is Great series, I wanted to ask you about this because very few Chinese women artists will identify explicitly as feminists. But you've told me before that experiences in your early childhood, which you've described as dark, unwanted, and neglected, made you think about how women were and are subjected to unfair treatment in Chinese society. So can you talk a bit about this, about your development of a feminist identity and feminist ideas?
I was born in northern China, which has a very strong traditional, the way of traditional thinking. So when I was born, they are considered women is more or less secondary, and boys is more important. And my grandparents, my mother, they all think that boys could be more important for the family because boy has more energy. They can do lots of hard work. They can get more money for the family. So when I was born as a girl, all the family members are very disappointed. I don't think anyone wanted my my existence that time. So they even dressed me as a boy clothes when I was 3 or 4 years old. I still have the picture. This is very interesting. But when I was a very small kid, these feelings always disturbing me. They don't like me, dislike me, and wanted, neglect, and so I have very strong inferiority from that time, and it's disturbing me for a long time, until I have one day I found I'm quite good in painting. I have a possibility to go to art school. And I try very hard. No one can help me, but I can help myself. From that minute, I feel something could be changed. Then until like a hard study, really do lots of practice. I get the opportunity to go to CAFA. It's a way of stepping out from the little town and go to a big city. So yeah, it's the first time that through art, I feel that I can change myself. So this kind of unwanted feeling totally changed like the art as a medicine for me. So this is very, very, after, at the very beginning in CAFA in Beijing, I remember the first year I'm in Beijing, I see a big city because it's totally different from my hometown. And no one from my hometown, from my family, they go to Beijing to study. So I was a little bit, I'm very shy, inferiority. I don't know how to deal with this, but every step, the art helps me to know my personality and give me confidence little by little. So I realized that this is not, the big inferiority is not my problem. It's the way they see me, it's the way they consider me. So I want the equal, I want the equal rights. I want to be equal treated. So it's not about how much power I wanted. I just want to be treated as equally as the others, as the other gender. That's it. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. I wonder, did you find when you were at the Central Academy of Fine Arts that male students were treated any differently than female students?
Because I always want to challenge something different. So I choose in the sculpture department, and the sculpture department has less female girls. So like we have 40 students and only 8 girls there. I think there are some difference always.
Yeah, I think it's very similar in other places. I think it's often seen as a macho male kind of discipline, which is interesting, and interesting that you chose that, you know, in this journey towards you know, demanding, I guess, equal rights. When did you first start thinking about using the female body, and specifically genitalia, as in these works, as your subject matter?
Actually, the first time I start to use this is in 2018. I went to Indonesia, Bali, for artist residency. There's colleagues from Norway, from Switzerland, from America, and also from Indonesia, and me. So I'm in a context of few girls from different countries. The way we are thinking and the way we are talking and treat ourselves are different. So from this context, I try to find my own position, how I think about myself. And then I practice with clay and dialect with the colleagues in Indonesia too. So because they are also has a very strong patriarchy system too. So in this way, I start to make something more or less like the vagina, but not very clear. But at this moment, it's like a key, the key of my inferiority, and it helped me gradually to think the possibility how to change myself. It's not about escaping. Escaping is a way. Stepping out is a way. But how to use the key to open it. So that's the start for this piece of work.
And what has been the reaction of audiences in China to the imagery of vaginas? Have you noticed different reactions inside and outside China? I think that you had said to me that when there was some social media response to your work that was partly positive, and also some surprisingly, you know, people really taking offense at these images. What have you noticed?
I think there are two different directions. The first in China, and the people relatively shy to see my work. But out of China, we are openly talk about it. So I feel like could we make the conversation more deeper? And then another layer is domestic in China. And when the man saw the work, they see and then have a look, then go. But the young generation, they are young girls, they are really involved and talk about their own experience. They have lots of same stories as me. So I feel you are really connected. And in the internet, it's very interesting because some of the comments are really harsh. And then they have a debate under the video in the comment area. So they have their own big conversation between support and against my work. So I think this is at the very beginning, I saw this conversation, my face was very hot. You know, I said, wow, that's the reality of the society. It's not in the gallery. It's put through my work in the society. Then they give me a feedback about what it is. They don't know the artist and the work speaks. So, but then I think, wow, that's very meaningful because the work has a functional, let them talk and really, no matter support or not, make them to think and disturbing their comfortable zones and disturbing their realization. So gradually I said, oh, that's very nice because they are making something different from
that is really interesting. So I was going to ask you whether you think that a younger generation of women in China have a different attitude to gender and to sexuality, to sexual politics than the older generation. So what do you think has changed in the way that young women are thinking about gender and feminism?
I think the younger generation, they know, they pay more attention to themselves, even they have the same experience as they are neglected and wanted, unwanted, all this kind of experience. But some of them go abroad study, some of them go to college, they get education, they read books, they open their eyes to see the world, they know their relationship with themselves and the world. So to be a girl is not their own problem, not only their own problem. So the younger generation, they are facing new possibilities. That's why they see my work, they are very excited, and they think they could have the same story, have the same conversation with me and with their generation. I'm born in 1980s, and some born in 1990s and 2000. They all have the same feeling, and they are more confident. I'm really proud of this. Yeah.
That's so interesting, I think. And so I was going to ask as well, in what way do you think that your choice to represent female bodies and to use the vagina as imagery is empowering women, and you found it, I think, empowering to you, and do you think it's, you know, a generally empowering image?
I think the first is physically is the essence of the difference between women and men, and also people are very shy about very shy and inferiority about ourselves. When I use the vagina, I don't think it's shy. It's we all born through vagina. We face our body, and we all, no matter man and woman, we all through vagina from mom. So this is very common. So why I don't use vagina?
Primal. Yeah.
So it's I think this is the direct way. I don't want to go in too much ways to say some words. I want to directly to tell one word and tell my information.
So, I mean, I mentioned how American feminist artists in the 1970s, like, for example, Judy Chicago, used vaginal imagery. And I'm not sure if you were aware of that work when you started doing this, but do you see your work as part of a continuum of feminist art practice, you know, a lineage of women artists? And is that how you see yourself?
Of course, when we study in the art college, we study art history. I know Judy Chicago's work and different artworks and different female artists' work. But when I really very beginning to do these works, it's a self-discovery, self-release. And I even forgot this piece. I know it's so important, but when I have that means it's more important about a dialect with myself. So, but after the work put exhibit in the museum, and then the people ask me the Judy Chicago, then I start, I'm talking a story about my background, my story from China, and she's talking about her generation and American. But it's a continuum, I think, yeah, because female movement is only, I mean, only those years, and patriarchy system is thousands of years. And if we see in a long history, this time is too little. And what we do, we need to repeat lots of things. People are easily to forget. Yes. What happened, and tomorrow maybe will be something else, and lots of information. What we do, we repeat and repeat and repeat. And I'm here in China, I repeat my voice, and she's in that age, that year, repeating her voice. Maybe another young generation repeating the same voice, but a different way of talk in different language, but repeating the women's rights, women's needs. So I think it's a continuous. We need to repeat again until one day the things can change. Yes. Why we repeat and maybe it's not change. So that's why our needs we need to ask for. Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And I think that, you know, any woman of my generation knows how, you know, things have to constantly be reinvented and repeated over and over again, you know, to aim towards any change. And I wanted, of course, to ask you about this because I'm talking about, you know, ideas about mothers and daughters. So these works, Mama, you collected, I know, old obsolete washboards, and then you cast them in porcelain. And I know that you actually started with one that belonged to your own mother. So what do the washboards mean to you? And how does this work reflect on your experiences of motherhood and daughterhood? And now, of course, you yourself are a mother as well. So that's probably changed in some ways how you think about it.
Actually, every time when I do my work, I always started from the physical interaction and the true feeling inside. I think only from this way it can be hold my work longer. It's like this installation I work for 5 years. If I don't have a very strong feeling, emotion on it, it's difficult to support me for 5 years to finish this installation. So the very beginning, I see the washboard from my mother, and because I was studying in Beijing, I do everything by myself. Then it's like throw me in the sea. No one can help me. But every time I go back, I remember how well treated my mom. Even she's not very. She's very humble family. And she didn't have very decent job, but she tried her best to raise me, to help me. So I know that love is very valuable. It's not about how much or how expensive he gave to me. It's how genuine the love it is. So I used her washboard and replica and cast it. But you know, when cast it into porcelain, in the texture is not very clear. It's just so I repeat and the texture and use different tools to do the surface. I want to feel how she used the time on how much hard work she do. This is very like an experimental feeling. It's like a healing myself to know more about my mom. So this is the first piece about my mother. And then I go to a different place. I say, oh, the mother love is the same, no matter in different provinces of China, no matter in China or India, the mother love is the same, but a different way. All the mother want to give a lot to their kids, no matter what kind of job they are. So these strong feelings keep me to finish this work and to appreciate the mother's love in different angles and for a lot of different stories. Right now I'm a mother, and it's very complicated feeling because I only have 3.5 months right now, the baby. I'm learning I'm learning to be parents, and I understand more about my mom. And this pure love is really unspeakable. You can really do it when the physical interaction. The words cannot really express too much. So I'm pretty sure I will do some works because the love is very strong. So I really need to discover little by little. My work is very slow, but I enjoy the very strong feelings of love. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to stop sharing here so that we can see each other more clearly. And yes, I think it's probably too early for you to say how motherhood may have changed you as an artist. We can see that there is some work on the shelves behind you. So I'm interested in your new work to finish up our conversation. But I really liked what you said about the fact that that's the sense of motherhood and the connection between mothers and daughters is something so physical. And I think that's what I wanted to emphasize as well, in the physicality of the works, of your works and the works of the other artists that I've shown today. So to finish up with, can you tell us something about the work that you are doing at the moment, if you are making new work in Shanghai?
I have 2 works are going on because even I'm taking care of kids, but I'm preparing, and the work, sometimes to produce work is one thing. More important is the way we think, how we think. So I keep on preparing and think the different layers. This is more interesting than just producing the work. So I have two series. So one is about the women's pain, because in China last few years, all different stories happened. I know in the little town, lots of different places, there's lots of women, they cannot see their story. So it's a collective stories I want to transform into art. I have a way to solve my own pain, but I also want to help them. It's not about help. Help is not equal. I want to share and their pain, because when you feel your own pain, it's very normal because you know your body. But when you can sense others' pain, your heart is getting more meaningful. So I want to feel more about this. So this work is keep on going with different material. I had to do it before, so it's a continuing project. Another project is about the verbal abuse, like the Lin Tianmiao's work. She did some verbal abuse, but I think right now the verbal abuse, they have a different context. At the very beginning, you see people say beach and all this work is very hard. But in our young generation, another generation, when we judge the people, said, "Oh, you look beautiful," or "You look a little bit fat." This also a kind of verbal abuse. So I'm discussing the verbal abuse. They are in different layers. And I travel different countries, and I studied this work from Mexico. So I talk with the people in Spanish, and then English context and Chinese context. I found the story are almost the same, no matter what language we use. So this is the continuing work called stigma. So I will prepare for the two works. About the motherhood, in my side, we need to develop a little bit. So I also looking forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Liu Xi. And I think probably it's now time that we could open it to any questions that people might have.
Thank you.
Before I ask my many questions that I just added to my list, because it's an interesting talk, thank you very much. I wanted to ask if one of the audience members have a question first, and you're welcome to start. There's nothing in the chat I see, but you can switch on your video, your audio if you like, if you have a question about the topic. Maybe I will just let you think a moment longer and start with my questions, because I felt that it was very personal what you shared, Liu Xi, about your own motherhood, about your memories about your childhood. And I feel that a lot of the artworks are very autobiographical. So they have a lot of personal histories, and it's not very common that you have 26 artists, 26 women with such powerful stories, and they're so vivid and they're so contemporary. And my question was, how is it for you to talk about feminism so openly? Because also you, Luise, you mentioned that not all of them want to be called the feminist, but you are very open about it, and you have experienced or you claim your rights, and I can feel the power behind it. And it's like, yeah, you want your female rights, but can you be so open also in China? Can you say, I'm a feminist? What are the reactions now of your family, for example, to your artworks? Do they react differently? You're still a woman. Has it changed? Because you said stepping out. Have you stepped out of this memory? Are you now talking or thinking about it differently?
It's also depend on the personality. I'm a very direct person, so I don't do too much other ways. I like it directly talking. So my way of express my work also quite directly. And it's in China right now. I think sometimes the work need audience, and the different audience has a different explanation. I have a very strong and clear ideas about my work. And if the audience, they have their own explanation and their own attitude, I totally respect them. So yeah, in China, they have a different attitude, and in different countries, maybe in India or Indonesia, people have a different attitude. I think, which is fine, but the most important is the artist to make the work is very clear. The rest, let them deal by the word. So I'm all open for that. In China, it's feminist or not feminist, it's all fine. Yeah, I mean, when the people make a definition about my work.
And Luise, could you add maybe why some don't want to be called feminist, or why is this a problematic term?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure we understand feminism differently I can speak for European history. We understand it also, the European art history, a bit different, or can you compare it? Or like feminist is such a big word, like maybe you can add a little bit to.
Yeah, it's a complicated history. China has its own feminist history, which is a very different one than the Western trajectory. So, you know, feminism emerged in China in the very early 20th century, at the end of the Qing dynasty, with a number of really strong feminist writers who were also often anarchists and poets. Yes, the writer He Yinzhen in 1907 wrote on the revenge of women. So there was a lot of writing. There's a strong history. But of course, everything became very complicated and very connected with state-sponsored feminism during the years of the 1950s and 60s, and particularly during the Cultural Revolution. So to some extent, some of the women that I've spoken to in China are reacting against that history of state-sponsored feminism and what they very much perceived as the erasure of gender distinctions. You know, as Chairman Mao himself said, the times have changed, men and women are the same. And so the experiences of women during that time were that they had to be good socialist comrades, but they also had to manage the household and the family and everything else at the same time. So at the end of that period, there was something of a retreat away from ideas about feminism and a re-embrace of distinctions of gender, about what it meant to be a woman, what is femininity. And at the same time, feminist texts were being translated in China, the first one being Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, which was really influential, but also quite controversial in China. And I think there is another element, unfortunately, which is that very often Western feminists in China, often through NGOs, American NGOs, for example, have really tried to teach Chinese women how they should do feminism, you know, in a very condescending way. And there's a reaction against that as well. So I think it's kind of multifaceted, and it is still difficult, I think, to be very politically active as a feminist. I mean, you know, as distinct from making art. And there's been, you know, a great deal of political pushback on that as well. So, and that's also connected with things like LGBTQI activism also. So it's kind of very complicated dynamic, I think. And Liu Xi is unusual in embracing that feminism and being, you know, very quite explicit about it, because certainly there are numerous other artists, some that I showed you, like Lin Tianmiao, like Tao Aimin, whose work we would look at and say, you know, this very much has been curated into feminist exhibitions. It appears to be dealing with feminist themes, but the artists themselves are much more ambivalent about that. And yet, you know, as I said, we look at their work through a lens of gender, and we see that they're dealing with women's stories and women's lived experiences. So in that sense, their work is feminist. And I think perhaps what Liu Xi was suggesting is that we don't necessarily need to label it as one thing or the other. Yeah.
I totally agree with Luis, the last message on the screen. And every woman they are doing their work it has the history there. So, but I think here in China about the feminist, the translation, because feminist, this letter is English. And then when we translate into Chinese, sometimes they call it 女权, sometimes called 女性主义. So their way, the translation is very complicated. Some people accept they are 女权, some people accept they are 女性. So the translation also is not very clear. But their work speaks. Their work speaks their message. That's more important. Yeah.
I think so too. And I think sometimes artists have said to me, you know, feminism is a Western thing. In fact, Lin Tianmiao said that to me. Feminism is a Western thing. But I think it's because, as Liu Xi says, that there have been these slippages of translation, and Niu Chuan Zhuyi has this implication of women's rights as a sort of fighting for rights, whereas Niu Xing Zhuyi has a kind of softer implication. And so a lot of the pushback, I guess, against a feminist identity is almost a linguistic issue of slippages in translation over time.
Yeah, I think the feminist, like this is a feminist, the people watch from different angle. So some of them they accept, and some of them they have a different explanation. I think it's all fine, because in the end, their work is showing in the museum, and this physical feeling with the audience is more important.
Yeah.
Another, just try for the audience before I have another question. Stephanie Fenner, you have your video on. Would you like to ask a question?
I just wanted to say hi. But also I'm interested in if you could, or one of you could talk about the history of exhibitions, or like how would you situate this exhibition looking back into the history? I'm thinking of the Half of the Sky exhibition in Bonn. And if you look from the development from that exhibition to Venice Biennial, for example, to the exhibition that you organized now, what happened? Like, why this exhibition now?
Is that a question for Christina?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. So what we recognize, no, I have to start the other way. In fact, it was Niels, the main curator of this project, who recognized after a visit to China, where he visited a lot of studios run by female artists. He recognized that the visibility of Chinese female artists is too weak. And in fact, we did a research, went through the major the major exhibitions in Western world about Chinese contemporary art. And there have been a lot of exhibitions on contemporary Chinese art that have been forming our perception of contemporary Chinese art as mainly male. And there has been only this one exhibition you mentioned in Bonn in 1998, Frauenmuseum Bonn, that was organized 2 years after another China exhibition at Kunstmuseum Bonn, curated by Dieter Ronte. without a single female position in the whole exhibition, with the explanation of the curator that he was not able to find a single female artist in entire China. Yes, and I think on the one hand, what happened is that it happened that a white male curator from Europe came to China and discovered for himself this vast richness of female art from China. And on the other effect, the fact that there has been not enough exhibitions about female art from China.
But maybe just to add as well, because now we have a co-curator. Liu Xi, you're not just exhibiting your artwork, you're also a co-curator of the exhibition together with Feng Bui and Christina Penitzdorfer and also Nils Olsen. And also we have Luise Guest, who is one of the advisory board members. So maybe this is also a very good introduction that this is a project with a long preparation period and there are so many voices included. And I think this is maybe this why now question. This is something where there is a must, there is a need, that there are a lot of different voices in the exhibition, and especially Chinese voices, Chinese female voices, and also experts. So I think you started with the white male going to China, and of course this is like the start, but I think also the recognition that there is a whole team making the exhibition and being very sensible and sensitive about the topic and everything. I think this makes it extraordinary. And also if you know the catalog, this is quite a good addition to the exhibition series that have been before.
You could also ask why only now?
We could also add too that in fact in China there is quite a history of women's exhibitions. So from the 1990s, and the first one, almost the first one, I think, was curated by the artist Yu Hong. And then throughout the 1990s, there were a number of exhibitions of women's art, including one curated by a male curator, Jia Fangzhou, called Century Woman, which included a very large number of women artists. And one of our other academic advisors for the exhibition, Shu Qin Cui, has written quite extensively about this history, because it was, it was not unproblematic. Sometimes the exhibitions really essentialized the work of the women artists and wanted to sort of, frame art by women in a very particular way as being very different from art by men, which is, problematic in various ways. But there were many more exhibitions of work by women artists in China, and yet they were not included in the exhibitions that brought contemporary Chinese art to the West, as Christina mentioned. And, that's the short-sightedness, I guess, of those who were curating those exhibitions. And I know when I went to start work on my book, Half the Sky, which was in about 2010 in China, and I was talking to people in Australia about how I was writing a book about Chinese women artists, and people would say things like, but where will you find them? Where on earth will you find them? And I kept saying, they're hiding in plain sight. There's women artists doing amazing work everywhere, but they're not represented at that stage. They were not represented by major galleries. I think that has definitely changed now. But they were absolutely right. You're right, Stephanie. They were not in those early exhibitions that brought Chinese contemporary art to the world outside China. And the exhibition in Bonn was very much as a response to that, as Christina pointed out.
Yeah. I have a question to Luise and both to Luise and Liu Xi. So during the project, I got the impression that sometimes, especially in for younger artists, to to have a good connection to an international gallery could be very important. So is my impression right that galleries play in China a kind of not a mediator, but a kind of Gelenk?
Yeah, but I think so. But is that particular to China, or is that everywhere with a younger generation of artists? Because I know when I talk now to younger artists in China, they often say things like, don't describe me as a Chinese artist. I'm a global artist. And, you know, we're talking pre-COVID, where artists were traveling constantly, globally, internationally. Liu Xi is a transnational artist working between Spain and Shanghai and, you know, traveling internationally, as are many of the younger artists. And artists need to do that to build a career and maintain a career, I think. And I speak as an Australian, and we're very far away, and Australian artists also very much want to establish themselves with an international gallery so that they can work transnationally and transculturally. So that's just my input, but I'm interested in what Liu Xi would say there too.
I think, you know, the younger generation, we get more influenced by Western. Because when we were in university, when I was in university, lots of lectures from Western artists and a lot of exhibitions in galleries and the museums. So we can always see lots of foreign artists. So the way of the thinking to see these exhibitions, and we may think different compared with the last generation. And the other younger generation, like born in 1990s, most of them go abroad to study. They think something different. And my generation, they mainly in the Central Academic Fine Arts or in all those kind of academic fine arts school. So always you can see all the change. They are according to the globally economic change all the time. And some of the younger generation, they study abroad and then they just sign the gallery abroad. They didn't touch the ground of China yet. They just developed their career outside of China. So there's all different possibilities, but the different generation, they changed. And of course, now the economic always play an important roles. So the artists have to work with galleries. Yeah.
I wanted to ask as well about Yu Hong again. So the artist you showed before, because we have a lot of series, and I was very interested to see in the exhibition Stepping Out that we have so many different kind of materials the artists used, and we saw sculpture with Liu Xi. We have so many. There's like such a broad spectrum of how to do it, and with Yu Hong, it's very specific that she's using this realistic painting style. And I also read about her that she uses it because it's also a traditional painting style she was taught in university, and she keeps using it to express this her change in life as well. And also that Hong, for example, means red because she was born in 1966 when the Cultural Revolution started. So for me, it was so interesting, and I was wondering if we can ever can read a little bit more into her painting style, and if it changes as well, because she's painting about her birth and her childhood, and if it's changing, and also when she starts to paint her daughter Liu Ba, if she changes it, because also the juxtaposition with the photographs. You showed another series which I didn't know before, it's only painting. So maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the styles, because our talk today, it's about gendered materiality, and for me, it was like, oh, this realistic painting style, is it also a gendered materiality in her sense? And if you just, this is not a very proper question, but if you just
that's good. Yeah, I think I know what you're asking.
Sorry,
and I think,
my thoughts just go. That was
No,
just
that's
like, this is so
good.
interesting, like how she did it.
I think that you're right that in fact, it is a gendered materiality because, of course, because of her generation, yes, she's taught and she herself teaches now at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. She was taught in a very specific way. So, you know, the painters of her generation were inheriting Russian painting styles that were used, you know, as partly as propaganda as well. So it's Soviet socialist realism, in a sense, a development from that at least. And I think she and her husband Liu Xi are two of the greatest figurative painters in China, very much so. But I think what they have both done is in many ways challenge the limitations of the style in which they were taught. Liu Xiaodong very much to examine the lives of forgotten people, whether that was workers on the Three Gorges Dam, or the men that he grew up with as boys in the village at home, or, you know, goat herders on the Mongolian plains, or, you know, he goes specifically and he investigates and immerses himself in particular communities. But Yu Hong has transformed what was a vehicle for propaganda, Soviet socialist realism, into a way of looking at herself and her own life and her female experiences in this very sort of painterly way. But that series, Witness to Growth, is only one small part of her practice. So another major part of her practice is in appropriating sort of iconic images, canonical images from Western art, and transforming them to look at aspects of Chinese society. So the, you know, the altarpiece by Jan van Eyck that I mentioned is one of those. But she's examining aspects of what she saw as a kind of cutthroat, dog-eat-dog kind of society at the beginning of reform and opening, where everybody wanted to get rich quick. You know, to get rich was glorious, as Deng Xiaoping probably didn't actually say. But that was her society that she was observing at that time. So I think her work is really, really interesting and sometimes not well understood outside of China because of its roots in that Russian style of realist painting that she was taught. But I think that what is particularly interesting about her is the way that she's transformed it to become a vehicle for something intensely personal and also very political because of what she is looking at. There's another series called She, where she examines particular women, writers, poets, the artist Xiaolu, for example, and paints portraits of women. But the way she uses her own life in that kind of diary, autobiographical style is, I think, very, very interesting. Because, of course, too often, as with Tao Aimin's work and the idea of domestic labor, I mean, these things are not considered important in the meta-narratives of whatever, you know, male artists might be dealing with. And the idea of these personal, fragmented, diary-like images was very contrary to the way that male painters were painting at the time that she was doing those. So I think there's something actually very radical about her practice. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
It does, actually. Just because I look at the time, and so there's a possibility to ask questions. Otherwise, I have one last question, because you also asked about the exhibitions and the history of exhibition of Chinese artists or Chinese female artists. So this is just a question I'm not sure if you can answer it, but how did this exhibition actually change the narrative? Or how did it change your life, Liu Xi? Or how will it change? Was it just like, was it an important step towards something? Or was it a good summary of who, or of some artists that are female? Or yeah, just wanted to add on a question. So maybe, is there an influence of this exhibition on your work, for example, Liu Xi, how it's now perceived in the world, because you're talking now via Zoom, this will be recorded, will be on YouTube, we have a lot of installation views. So is there an impact? I think that's my question.
You know, this exhibition, lots of work cannot exhibit in China. So, and from different generations, from 60s until 90s, and it's a lot of change following the Chinese economically, politically, or different, socially different, change a lot. So like in they born in 1960s, few of them get educated in university. And until nowadays, most young generation, they all get education. So it's a totally different change. It's a side history about women after China founded. And it's like a little book about women's story. I think this is very, very touching, because not only from a small angle, it is a small angle, because in China, not all this work can exhibit, but there is a big angle. You can, besides the work, you read lots of stories, and they are all individual and vivid human beings, and they are invisible women or visible women, but a tough life. So I feel it's very difficult to express by words, but this important exhibition is very, very meaningful to all of us. And I hope, like Luise said, write the book Half Sky, but maybe another 10 years later, and different female exhibition will be exhibit. So it's a different change, will be something different. I'm all looking forward for this, because at this point, this story happened, and then it had an impact. Then it will change probably some possibility for future. And let's see. But I really appreciate for all what happened about stepping out, and everyone make all the effort to make it true and to make it more meaningful and more deep, and in different locations, in 3 different venues. I really appreciate. Yeah, thank you so much for this.
I think we can give that back to you, and to you, to Luise, or to family, and the woman, the other experts from the advisory board. It was a great project.
It's certainly been a huge privilege and a pleasure for me to be a small part of this important project. I think it is really important, and I said to Christina earlier that when I walked around the exhibition, what really struck me was that it's a picture of a society undergoing transformation through those 3 generations. And then, as Liu Xi says, it's those individual stories of those particular women, the artists themselves, and other women that they depict in their work. So I think it's very profound.
I think these were the very best last words. Thank you very much. This is recorded, so you are able to watch it again, maybe to dive deeper. The exhibition is on until the 25th of June, so not so long anymore. So if you have the chance to see it or see it again, come to the museum. This is a goodbye for me. Thank you very much, but I will pass it over to Christina and everyone else.
Yeah. Just one thing before we leave. We have another part in the series of expert talks. There will be another one tomorrow evening with Monica Merlin, talking with the artist Zhao Yu, who we saw already today in Luise's PowerPoint. The title will be Understanding Chinese Women's Artistry. Start will be at 6 p.m. So a bit later than today, will be also again in English. You are very welcome and invited to participate also tomorrow. And for now, thank you all for joining us in this round.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Liu Xi, it must be very late now in Shanghai. What time is it?
It's like 11:38, but yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
We will let you sleep now.
Thank you for keeping up for us, for staying up for us. Yes.
I hope the baby
Thank you so much.
sleeps.
I'm very happy to see Luis. Yeah.
It's so lovely to see you. It's really great. Yeah, it's really nice. One day we'll actually meet in person.
Yeah, of course. And please enjoy Salzburg. It's a really beautiful place.
So beautiful. Yes, it is. It is. It's great that you were able to come to the exhibition here. Yeah, it's great.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
Okay.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.